Thank you for joining with us today as we discuss the fall of Saigon and the aftermath on the Lessons of Vietnam show. We broadcast from the studios of Nissan Communications, and thanks to him, we're able to get out and get the real story of what happened in Vietnam and so forth. I am your host, Bill Dixon, Vietnam veteran, 1967-68. I was at Long Binh Post, located in 3 Corps of South Vietnam. If you've seen some other shows, you know it was divided into 4 corps. Now, today's show is going to be a little bit different in that normally I will ask you to call in and participate either by computer's 2K voice or by telephone, but today is pre-recorded because of tonight or tomorrow when I'm supposed to be doing the show. I'll be in the middle of a procedure with the VA hospital, so I couldn't be in 2 places. So don't call in this time. All right. As we go into the fall of Saigon, we're going to talk a little bit about what brought us up to the Saigon, and then we're going to talk about the aftermath. But the next one I want to talk to you about, of course, is, as always, the Veterans Crisis Line. They're still saying 22 veterans a day are committing suicide. If you know a veteran or you are a veteran, please take heed of the information here. There's some good people waiting on the other line to talk with you. So reach out to other veterans and so forth. Also, by the way, if you are a active duty Coast Guard, or you know somebody that's active duty Coast Guard and they're not getting paid, the American Legion has money to pay them their salary. So if you are a Coast Guard and you're not getting paid, reach out to your local American Legion post and they will process it and get you some money. Thank you. What we're talking about now is the Vietnam after the fall of Saigon and the whole of South Vietnam. As you can see there, Saigon surrenders to Viet Cong, withdrawal ends role of U.S. North and South Vietnam become the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Okay. As we talk about the fall of Saigon and North-South Vietnam coming together to be one unified country in theory. Now, I added the word in theory. I try to not editorialize a whole lot, but I've been over to Vietnam, and it is in theory. There is still 2 Vietnams. There's one for government and in South Vietnam for economy. Let's visit the time just prior to those events. Nixon started the Vietnamization of the war in Vietnam by training the South Vietnamese military to step in and replace the American military. This was in spite of the reports that South Vietnam could not stand on its own against North Vietnam, supported by China and the Soviet Union or any other communist countries without United States support. But even though he knew it wasn't going to work, he kept talking about how great it was and so forth. But history has proven that that really didn't work. But okay. Lyndon Johnson, faced by students chanting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many boys did you kill today?" But it was also, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Opted not to run for re-election in 1968. President Nixon was elected on a pledge to bring the Vietnam War to an honorable end. Let me go back and read that again because I think that word honorable is important. President Nixon elected on a pledge to bring the Vietnam War to an honorable end. He instituted a policy of Vietnamization we talk about, withdrawal of American troops and replace them with South Vietnamese soldiers, while continuing to support the South Vietnamese government with military and financial aid. Vietnamization. Nixon speaks with honor. Le Duc Tho, a North Vietnamese leader, and basically Ho Chi Minh at this time was more or less a figurehead. Le Duc Tho was actually the one who running North Vietnam at the time with the Politburo. Negotiated a ceasefire agreement with U.S. official Henry Kissinger during the Paris peace talks to end the Vietnam War. The 2 men were jointly awarded the 1973 Nobel Prize for Peace, but Le Duc Tho declined his. South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thu was not happy with the negotiations because he was basically left out. Nixon threatened to cut off U.S. economic, military, and political support of South Vietnam if they refused to accept the Paris peace agreement. Negotiations resumed on January 8, 1973, due to Nixon going to South Vietnam and says, don't negotiate until I get to be president because I'll give you a better deal. And that's what delayed the Paris peace talks. Negotiations resumed on January 8, 1973, and the United States and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam initial agreement on January 23rd. Thieu reluctantly accepted a settlement despite his continued misgivings, and the peace agreement was officially signed on January 27, 1973. The peace settlement enabled the United States to withdraw from the war and welcome American prisoners of war back home. And that's some of the returning POWs on the plane. I know right there the pilot is saying we have now left Vietnamese airspace with how happy they look there. None of the Vietnamese parties abided by the settlement, however, and the war continued. So we had a peace agreement. North Vietnam didn't abide by the peace treaty. South Vietnam didn't abide by the treaty. Basically, the only people that abided by it was the United States. Direct American military involvement ended on 15th of August, 1973, as a result of Congress passing the Case-Church Amendment. The Case-Church Amendment was the legislation attached to a bill funding the U.S. State Department. It was approved by the United States Congress in June of 1973 that prohibited further U.S. military activity in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia unless the president secured congressional approval in advance. This ended direct U.S. military involvement in the Vietnam War, although the United States continued to provide military equipment and economic support to the South Vietnamese government for a while. It is named for its principal co-sponsors, Senator Clifford P. Case, Republican from New Jersey, and Frank Church, Democrat from Idaho. Nixon had gained Thieu's adherence to the agreement through a series of letters and envoys. All promised U.S. military support in the event of a North Vietnamese violation of the accords. In other words, what we're trying to say here is Nixon promised South Vietnam that if the North Vietnamese broke the peace agreement, came across the South line, that we would send bombers in. On November 14, 1972, for example, Nixon wrote Thieu that I repeat my personal assurance to you that the United States will react very strongly and rapidly to any violation of the agreement. Both sides understood this to mean the recommitment of B-52s to combat. In the end, these commitments were not upheld due to a combination of factors: domestic and congressional reluctance to re-engage in the war with the Case-Church Amendment, and finally the Watergate scandal, which weakened and distracted Nixon. Having rebuilt their forces and upgraded their logistics system, North Vietnamese force triggered a major offensive in the Central Highlands in March of 1975, which we've talked about a couple times on the show. On April 30th, 1975, NVA tanks rolled through the gates of the Presidential Palace in Saigon and effectively ending the war. Now, the city of Dong Ha, or the town of Dong Ha, which is right up from the DMZ, been there several times. When we left Vietnam, the police treatment allowed 150,000 North Vietnamese troops to remain in the South, which makes no sense at all if you look at it. We're going to have a peace treatment between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, but we're going to leave the North Vietnamese communists, 150,000 men, in South Vietnam that they're not supposed to do anything with. Okay, the town of Dong Ha, as you see there, if you see the arrow, in Quang Tri Province, right above Hue, like I said, we're right there at the DMZ. The North was positioned for eventual victory. The Americans were fed up with the war to the point of exhaustion. The ally that America had long supported and continued to guarantee the safety of was facing certain doom. In other words, when America signed that peace treaty, they knew South Vietnam couldn't hold up on its own, but they signed the peace with honor in spite of that. And then if you're out there and you're young enough that you don't remember the Watergate, Watergate is a hotel in Washington, D.C. It's a beautiful hotel. Used to stay in a hotel across the street from that quite a bit. The Republican Party, or some of the people in the Republican Party, they call them the plumbers, broke into the Democratic headquarters there and stole some information and so forth. And of course, Nixon said that he had nothing to do with it, but he ended up resigning. And his famous says, "I am not a crook." Pressure of impeachment for alleged illegal activity in the Watergate scandal. So, as the North Vietnam were looking at the Watergate going on, they tried a couple of little small fence into South Vietnam just to see how the United States would react, and we didn't react, so gave them more power, so they kept stepping up until we just talked about. By 1975, Watergate had unraveled the presence of Richard Nixon, and throughout the negotiations and signing of the agreement, Kissinger and Nixon had privately promised South Vietnam's president, Nguyen Van Thu, that America would intervene in any hostilities broke out between North and South. But Thu knew that these promises were fragile because the power was taken away from Nixon when he resigned. Congress was already ticked off about the whole situation. In a final plea for assistance, President Thu penned a personal letter to a man he had never met, and that was President Gerald Ford, who took over after Nixon had resigned. Actually, Nixon's vice president had resigned earlier because of criminal activities, and then Gerald Ford took over as vice president for a brief time, and then he ended up being taking Nixon's place. So, Hanoi's intention to use the Paris Agreement for a military takeover of South Vietnam was well known to us at the very time of negotiating the Paris Agreement. Or you can say the Paris Agreement, peace with honor, according to Nixon. Firm pledges were then given to the United States, were given to us that the United States would retaliate swiftly and vigorously to see any violation of the agreement. We consider these pledges that the most important guarantee of the Paris Agreement. Those pledges have now become the most crucial ones to survive. That is what President Thu from South Vietnam wrote Gerald Ford. In March 1975, the North Vietnamese army launched a full-scale invasion of the South. Thu, of course, asked for help from the United States. Nixon had resigned after the Watergate scandal. New President Gerald Ford asked Congress to supply the aid. Not only did Congress refuse, some of the congressmen got up and walked out of the meeting to make sure it's been done. So here's a book that was written by Larry Berman. I've met Larry Berman. Just a lot about what we just talked about. Nixon, Kissinger, and betrayal in Vietnam. No peace, no honor. That's a book I recommend that you get and read. Nixon held up the peace talks until he became president, as we talked about. This delay cost many American lives, but it was 3 years or so from the time after Nixon became president, we got back to their peace talks. So a lot of Americans died during that hold up until I get to be president. He was worried that if they talked too much peace, that Humphrey would be elected president rather than him. Nixon initiated Vietnamization, even though all reports he had received said it would not work without American support. Nixon and Kissinger negotiated a peace amendment that assured North Vietnam would take over South Vietnam. The billions of dollars Nixon promised North Vietnam in reparations were never paid, which created problems with getting our unaccounted for back, because the North Vietnamese were steadfast that they expected to get some reparations for rebuilding their country after all the bombing and so forth, and there was no money coming forth. They held out with any information about POWs or missing in action and so forth. The North Vietnamese conducted numerous smaller attacks into the South to test whether Washington would support the South Vietnamese as promised. When nothing happened, North Vietnam began its full-scale offensive in the South in late January 1975, just 2 years after the ceasefire had been established by the Paris Peace Accords. The North Vietnamese launched Campaign 275. You see Hanoi, you see the DMZ, and you see Hue, PRESSO, and what we're going to be talking about in just a moment is Ban Me to It. And you can see Saigon in the train. And South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thu orders withdrawal of South Vietnamese forces from the Central Highlands. You see way there, right, that's about where the Central Highlands are, because they're a little more mountainous up above it. The objective of this campaign was the capture of Man Me Thuot in Central Highlands. That is the objective of the North Vietnamese. Thu brought his forces down from Central Highlands, trying to strengthen up the more forces in the south and more around the capital. The Battle of Ban Me Thuot began on March 4th, and the North Vietnamese quickly encircled the city. As it became clear that the communists would take the city and probably the entire Dar Lac province, Thu decided to withdraw his forces in order to protect the more critical populous areas. Accordingly, he ordered his forces in the Central Highlands to pull back from their positions. Abandoning PRESSO and Kon Tum, the South Vietnamese forces began to move towards the sea. But what began as an orderly withdrawal soon turned into panic. And there's a reason for that, which I think I'm going to talk about on the next slide or so. But they were started moving. One more after that. But that's something you can see them moving there and so forth. On March 15th, PRESSO, Kon Tum, and Dar Lac in the Central Highlands were abandoned by senior military officers, leaving the civilians and remaining ARVN troops, that was the South Vietnamese troops, to find their own way to safety. That's what caused the panic and the no correlation and so forth. The officers left, and they left their troops. They deserted their own troops. So without a leader, we had panic and just total mayhem. Many of them trekked south in the Trang, most without any weapons or supplies for the journey, while communist troops continued to harass the fleeing refugees. There you can see the refugees coming down the road. The Viet Cong continued, or North Vietnam continued mortaring and shelling them as they were moving down. The remaining ARVN troops defended the convoy to the best of their abilities, but 30 to 40,000 people were killed or died of starvation during the 15-day retreat. The press dubbed the event the Convoy of Tears. So they retreating people who were being run out of their homes and so forth. What ARVNs there were still fighting, continued to try to help them. We still lost between 30 and 40,000 people by the communists of their own people. As the month of March continued, Da Nang became choked with almost 1 million refugees and leaderless soldiers. Looting and panic rocked the city until the final evacuation on March 26th to 28th, somewhere around there. Soldiers without somebody keeping them in line and so forth. You can look back at My Lai, where the atrocities that Americans created without proper leadership. Well, these guys didn't have any leadership. They didn't know where they were going to get their food. They didn't know anybody tell them what to do, the weapons and so forth. They were in uniforms that they knew they'd be shot on sight, and so forth. The Americans airlifted out their personnel and tried to evacuate as many of their Vietnamese workers as possible. Anybody that worked for the Americans as a secretary or interpreter or whatever was named as in a book. And they knew that as soon as the Americans left, that book would be pulled out and they'd all be killed. Ed Daly of World Airways flew a mission out of Saigon to the airlift at Da Nang in order to save more people. He tried to send his own planes over there. As you can see him getting on the planes and so forth. The first of his planes to land were mobbed so badly that it almost did not take off. That was everybody trying to get on that plane at the same time, as you can see there in the picture. You got people, planes full, and you still got people on the gangway there trying to get in. The pilot on the grain had to tell the others not to land because it was too dangerous. Desperate people began filling out boats into the harbor in an effort to escape the city, and many left with nothing but their clothes on their backs. And we're talking about Da Nang. By the time the boats arrived in Cam Ranh Bay on April 1st, many refugees had died of thirst. In order to get people off the plane like that, to save the ones who were on the plane, Sometimes they had to resort to weapons to force people off the plane because the plane couldn't take off with all those people. So they're trying to save at least the ones on the plane and let them wait for the next plane. But nobody wanted to wait because there was nobody there to control the crowd and make them feel better and so forth. It was just total mayhem. Let me get on there. Don't worry about everybody else. You can see there Swan Lock, and you can see Saigon. The left arrow is the city of Saigon there. Swan Lock was very close to Saigon. As the North Vietnamese forces closed on the approaches to Saigon, the Politburo in Hanoi issued an order to General Van Tien Dung, I'm going to just call him Dung, to launch the Ho Chi Minh campaign, the final assault on Saigon itself. Now, by that time, Saigon had already reached out to North Vietnamese troops coming down. Let's talk, let's negotiate. And North Vietnam says, we ain't negotiating, we're coming down. Dung began to move his forces into position for the final battle. The South Vietnamese 18th Division made a valiant final stand at Swan Lock, 40 miles northeast of Saigon, and the South Vietnamese soldiers destroyed 3 of Dung's divisions. So all this information you hear sometimes about how the South Vietnamese just folded up. Those who had leadership and well-trained, they stood and fought, and they wiped out 3 of his divisions. However, the South Vietnamese succumbed to the superior North Vietnamese numbers because they were running out of ammunition, food, clothing, and everything else because we cut off the flow of supplies. There they are, coming into Saigon. I'm not even going to try to pronounce the North Vietnamese call it what they call that day. They call it the liberation of the South, which is kind of a joke into itself, which we'll talk about. And the South Vietnamese call it the day of losing the nation. But there's the tanks and the North Vietnamese soldiers coming in, and a lot of the people are running up going, yay, welcome. And the day before they were going, yay, Americans, because you had to act like you liked the North Vietnamese, whether you did or not, because you get shot real quick. And of course, there was quite a few of them that were communists that were in the city and so forth. Now, Nguyen Van Thu left early. So he had to get somebody to take over the government. Dong Van Minh, or as we called him, Big Men, who had been president of South Vietnam for only 3 days, at 10:24 announced a surrender and asked South Vietnamese forces to cease hostility and calm and to stay where they are, while inviting a provisional revolutionary government to engage in a ceremony of orderly transfer of power so as to avoid any unnecessary bloodshed in the population. You may have seen some old pictures where the South Vietnamese soldiers at that time were taking the uniforms off and trying to find civilian clothes because they didn't want anybody to know that they were in the military. As far as the easy transfer of government, it wasn't all that easy. The communists were not exactly in a mood to work with anybody. But that's Big Mem, who got to be president for all of 3 days. The last 2 servicemen known to have died in combat in Vietnam, Charles McMahon and Darwin Judge. McMahon and Judge were members of the Marine Security Guard Battalion at the U.S. Embassy Saigon and were provided security for the DAO Compound and adjacent to Tân Sơn Nhứt Airport in Saigon. Now, then the Tân Sơn Nhứt Airport was on the outside of Saigon. Today it's in about the middle of Saigon. But McMahon had arrived in Saigon on 18th of April, while Judge had arrived in early March. Both died in a North Vietnamese rocket attack on Tân Sơn Nhứt on the morning of April 29th, 1978. 75, yes, I don't know where I got 8 from. Sometimes I wonder about myself. Now, this is a picture of the American Embassy. Now, you remember all those pictures about the people escaping Vietnam from the top of the American Embassy? I can tell you, it don't look a bit like that. The American Embassy is no longer there. It has been torn down within the last few years. The building that was actually, where you see that famous picture, was actually the CIA building off in the campaign. That building is actually still there, but the embassy is no longer there. The communists renamed the city after Ho Chi Minh, Former president of North Vietnam, although his name was not frequently used outside of official business, it's even less used now because he was just a figurehead back then. Order was slowly restored, although by then deserted U.S. embassy was looted along with many other businesses. Communication between the outside world and Saigon were cut. One objective of the communist government was to reduce the population of Saigon. During the war, a lot of the rice farmers and people in rural areas had all gone into Saigon as refugees because as the fighting was going on, as there were North Vietnamese were coming down, a lot of the people in the outskirts of the big cities became refugees and moved into town. So all of a sudden now you got all these people living in Saigon, as it says, which had been swollen with the influx of people during the war, was now overcrowded with high unemployment. Re-education classes for former soldiers in the South Vietnamese armed forces indicated that in order to regain full standing in society, they would need to move from the city and take up farming. Handouts of rice to the poor, while forthcoming, were tied to pledges to leave Saigon for the countryside. According to the Vietnamese government, within 2 years of the capture of the city, 1 million people had left Saigon, and the state had targeted of 500,000 further departures. Now, it says here that they had left Saigon. They weren't given a whole lot of choices. A lot of them were packed up and moved out to communal farms. As you realize, the communists took over all the rice farms and any other kind of farms out there, and they put people out there to work in the communes of the farms and so forth. So it wasn't always let's move, and because this city is too crowded, let's move out. But it was you are going to move out, and whether you like it or not, we're going to help you. This is from a guy that was in Vietnam, an American. Bitter Memories, The Fall of Saigon in April 1975. And this is a podcast or whatever he had written. I'm going to read it pretty much verbatim as just like he wrote it. I listened to anything I could hear to keep track of what was happening. It was April of 1975. I was in Saigon waiting for the North Vietnamese to attack. My wife and our 4 children and I lived in an elegant villa on Le Van Duet Street in the residential section of Saigon, near the presidential palace. Now, he knew they were coming, and he wanted to get his family out, but there was a problem. That's where they were when a disgruntled South Vietnamese pilot bombed the palace not long before the city fell. With the northern half of the country now captured, communist forces moved south towards Saigon. I knew capitulation was imminent. To reduce the number of in-country people I was responsible for, I considered sending out some personnel, including my secretary, on the first Operation Baby Lift flight for April. Now, Operation Baby Lift was to get the American children out. The first plane leaving Saigon, loaded with babies, and 140 women crashed. There's been some question about there was a bomb on there. 178 died on Operation Baby Lift. The project launched by President Ford was an effort to save as many orphans, mostly American, as possible because we knew how vicious the North Vietnamese would be to the half American, half Vietnamese children. The adults on board the aircraft, all volunteers, would act as caretakers for the children. That's the crash site. That's some of the people on the plane. As you can see, the headlines from Stars and Stripes. The day after the Operation Baby Lift disaster, none of his people were on the first plane. I took my wife to lunch at the American Officers Club. Now, here are the North Vietnamese communists coming down, and they're going to lunch at the American Officers Club to break the news to her that she and our 4 children must leave the country immediately. She was incredulous. Just that morning, she'd gone to coffee at the embassy. Officials in attendance had advised the gathering to disregard news reports. We are all safe and had nothing to fear. Unpersuaded by my urging, she finally agreed to go on 3 conditions. She could choose the flight date, she and the children could tour the world on the way back to the United States, and she could have a new Buick station wagon as soon as she got home. But the embassy was saying, hey, everything's fine and dandy, just like it always was. I disguised my family's departure to look like a vacation in Bangkok. See, the ambassador forbade evacuations. More about that later. And got tickets for them to fly out on 9 April. We've been a little late. On the 8th, a renegade South Vietnamese Air Force pilot bombed the presidential palace close to our house. My wife was now convinced, because of the 24-hour curfew imposed by the South Vietnamese government in the wake of the airstrikes, I had to pull rank to drive my family through the multiple roadblocks in Saigon to the airport at Tân Sơn Nhứt. But at last, I got them on a plane headed for Bangkok. Ambassador Martin, who, by the way, is from North Carolina, refused to consider evacuations. On the one hand, he wished to avoid doing anything that might stampede the South Vietnamese. On the other, he genuinely believed that the prospect of the communist flag flying over South Vietnam was unthinkable. Not that it wasn't possible, but it was unthinkable. My stateside boss, by the way, this gentleman was CIA in communications. My stateside boss, General Lou Allen, the director of NSA, ordered me to close down the operation and get everyone out before someone got killed. But the ambassador would not hear of it. I made him a proposition. If he would let my people go, I would stay in Saigon until the end with the skeleton staff, that the flow of SIGINT reports, that's information coming in, reports for him from NSA would continue. He turned me down. So I cheated. I sent employees and their families out on any way I could. Some I had to order out. They were unwilling to leave me behind. Some went on trumped up early home leave, some on contrived vacations. Others I sent on a phony business travel. One day towards the end, I bought a guy a ticket with my own money and with no authorization or orders to get him out. On 22nd April, the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency estimated that the Republic of Vietnam wouldn't last more than a week. It was comforting to see that the Department of Defense and the Commander-in-Chief, SINPAC, harbored no delusions about what was happening in Vietnam. But the ambassador was not in their chain of command. The ambassador reported to the Secretary of State and the President. Unless they overruled him, he still had the power to keep all in Saigon. He was convinced no evacuation was necessary. Despite the ambassador's refusal to call for evacuation, ongoing commercial airlines were choked with passengers, and U.S. Air Force C-130 and C-141 transports daily carted hundreds of Vietnamese and Americans out of the country. A lot of the Vietnamese officers who'd been hiding money suddenly left the country. The embassy made a point of explaining that their departure was not an evacuation. It was a reduction in forces to free up resources to help the Republic of Vietnam. Think about that one. I repeated what I had already reported to him, that Saigon was surrounded by 16 to 18 North Vietnamese divisions poised to strike. Communist troops less than 2 kilometers north of my office at the airport were awaiting the command to attack. The ambassador put his arm around my shoulder and guided me to the door. Young man, when you're older, you'll understand things better. And he showed me out. Frantic, I went down the hall to the office of the CIA station, Tom Polgar. He laughed at my frenzy and showed me a cable to Washington the ambassador had released that morning. It stated that no signals of intelligence evidence of a forthcoming assault could be disregarded. That any signals, let me read that again. Any signals of an imminent attack could be disregarded. This came from the ambassador to Washington. It was all due to the communist skillful use of communications, deceptions, stun. I asked Tom, that's what the ambassador said. It was all due to the communist skillful use of communication and deception. Stunned, I asked Tom what evidence he had of communication deception. He waved my question away and bet me a bottle of champagne, Chateau and vintage of my choice, that he and I would still be in Saigon a year later, hence, still at our desk, still doing business as usual. Graham Martin later told Congress that he had been advised by the Hungarian members of the International Commission of Control and Supervision, the ICCS, that the North Vietnamese had no intention of conquering Saigon. They wished to form a coalition government with the patriotic forces in the South. This from a representative of a communist government allied to North Vietnam. And the ambassador believed him in the face of overwhelming signals, intelligence that the attack was at hand. Or was he naive? On the 24th of April, the wire services, which we monitored, reported a speech that President Ford had given the previous day at Tulane University. He referred to Vietnam as a war that is finished. His ambassador still said, ain't nothing going on. The president gets up in front of everybody and says, the war is finished. My cynicism overcame my dread. If the war was finished, what was I, a civilian signals intelligence officer and a potential prisoner of single value to the communists, in short, a spy doing a combat zone with nothing but a .38 revolver to defend myself against 18 North Vietnamese divisions? Then a series of messages that I'll never forget flowed in. They asked me to get children out of the country. The requests were from American men who had fathered kids in Vietnam and wanted to save them. I shuddered to think of what might happen to Amerasian youngsters when the communists took over, but it was too late. I had no vehicles and couldn't even get out of the compound, surrounded by panically crowds anxious for escape, much less to address the children's fathers gave to me. To this day, I don't know how the senders managed to get me the message to me. That's a young Amerasian girl there. I telephoned the embassy. Now, like I said, the embassy was in Saigon. Tân Sơn Nhứt Air Base was just outside of Saigon at the time. I telephoned the embassy. The evacuation is on. Get us out of here. The lady I talked to was polite, even gracious. She explained to me, as one does to a child, that the embassy could do nothing for us. We were too far away, and although I probably didn't know it, the people in the streets were rioting. Of course I knew it. I could see them. I uttered an unprintable curse. She responded, "You're welcome." As you can see there, they're charging the embassy grounds because they all had worked for American forces over there in one way or the other, and they knew their name was in the book. I was barely conscious when we approached the U.S. Oklahoma City flagship of the 7th Fleet. The pilot circled 4 or 5 times before coming down very slowly in the ship's small floodlit helipad. Now, I think it goes into it in a minute, but they're on the helicopter trying to escape the chaos that's going on back there. One of the last helicopters out. He told me subsequently that he, a civilian employee of Air America, which was CIA, had never before landed on a ship. As we got out of the slick into the lashing rain, flashbulbs went off and someone took my .38. Sailors immediately tipped over the Huey over the side and dumped it into the sea. I faintly remember some kind of processing, answering questions, and filling out forms, but I wasn't half there. But he's gotten out of Saigon and he's now on a Navy ship. The sea between and among the ships of the 7th Fleet and to the western horizon, as far as I could see, was filled with boats, sampans, junks, fishing vessels, commercial craft, tugs, even what looked like large rowboats, each overloaded with Vietnamese waving and calling to the ships. None of the 2,700 Vietnamese who worked with us, that's his particular office outside the airport there, escaped. All were killed or captured by the North Vietnamese. Many could have been saved, but 2 factors. The ambassador failed to call for an evacuation by the time it was countermanded by the by the North Vietnamese, are already in the streets of Saigon. And 2, the general in command of those 2,700 abandoned his troops. They were still awaiting his orders when the North Vietnamese attacked them. Ambassador Graham Martin's career was effectively ended by the debacle he authored in Saigon. He retired not long after to follow Saigon. This is still him. When I got back to the States, my marriage crumbled. The home I yearned for didn't exist, and I was afraid I was going to lose my children, my reason for staying alive. I knew I needed help, but my job was in intelligence, and I had top secret code word plus intelligence clearances. Had I sought therapy, I would have lost my clearance and therefore my job. That was a problem back then. If you had a problem, you couldn't tell anybody about it that was like that you can today. If you had post-traumatic stress or whatever, you had to keep it shut because it would ruin your career. I had to grit my teeth and endure the irrational rages, flashbacks, nightmares, and panic attacks. As it happens, my vocation and my need to help others saved me. Now, this is from another lady. That was from American. It was there. This is me on. I'm going to just call it on. Left Vietnam when Saigon fell, and member of the President Ford's Advisory Council on Indo-Chinese refugees. She was not part of his committee. It was not part of his committee at the time. She was a Vietnamese who later became part of his committee. When Saigon first fell, there was much speculation in the West about the likelihood of a bloodbath. As the months passed, however, and there was little news, the speculation began to taper off. At the time Saigon fell, most people in the West assumed that if there was a bloodbath, it would have to be motivation by anger, by the communist desire for revenge and retaliation. That's her. Since none of these emotions were detected in North Vietnamese rulers and that were well-disciplined troops as they marched into Saigon, onlookers conclude there would be no bloodbath. Senator McGovern scoffed at the Ford administration for his predictions. It's ridiculous, he said, to believe that McMahon, the chief representative of the National Liberation Front at the Paris peace talks, Madame Ben, is going to murder her compatriots. The senator was right. Madame Ben was not going to murder anyone. The communist system itself took on the job. Seen in its proper context, the bloodbath is only one of the three columns holding up the structure known as One Red Vietnam. These three columns are reunification with Hanoi as the capital, full-scale Marxist revolution in the South, and political purge, i.e. bloodbath. The program was not ready to be put into effect immediately following the takeover. Hanoi was not in a position to take the South militarily. It was in order to take them militarily, but not turn it over to the communists overnight. A bloodbath in the aftermath of the takeover would have served no purpose except to unleash emotions. But the communist system had no place for real emotions as a machine which expertly creates synthetic emotions such as hatred of U.S. imperialists for its own ends. In other words, they taught how bad the Americans were to the Vietnamese. A bloodbath at that time would have been counterproductive under the glare of international publicity and scrutiny. Thousands of foreigners, including scores of foreign correspondents, were still in Vietnam, all of them watching the behavior of the victorious troops. The press in the world wanted to see how this long, bitter war would end. Hanoi wanted money for reconstruction and did not wish to jeopardize chances of being given aid by an early and spectacular massacre that would have awakened the conscience of the free world. You remember the reparations that Nixon had promised. If Hanoi is to get American aid, it must rely on those same elements in American society that had fought against the Vietnam War so effectively. It must get them to work American public opinion and the U.S. government around to such a course. And those elements do not like hearing about bloodbaths. In other words, everything had to be kept hunky-dory for a while. But as the money didn't start coming in from America. Hanoi has other reasons besides the obvious economic ones for wanting U.S. aid. It hopes to avoid total reliance on either the USSR or China. It views U.S. reparations as the final step in the humiliation of America. In other words, the best way to to really stick it to America is that America has to give them money as well as move out of the country. Thus, for all these reasons, the bloodbath had to be delayed. However, in March of 1976, the bamboo curtain began to come down. All foreign correspondents, news agencies, reporters, and UN and Red Cross representatives were ordered to leave Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, before May 8th, 1976. In other words, any eyes and ears outside of Vietnam had to leave. On June 10th, both Hanoi and Saigon announced that 12 categories of people would face trial by people's tribunals. Among those to be severely punished, the lackers of U.S. imperialization. Those people who work for us, South Vietnamese people who work for us. Those veterans of Thu's puppet regime who failed to repent their crimes, and those who owed blood debts to the people and to past and present enemies of the government and revolution. This is not the first appearance of Vietnam of people's tribunals. North Vietnamese refugees vividly remember that from 1956 to 1959, people's tribunals using denunciations and torture were responsible for 200,000 deaths in the North. Thousands of urban Vietnamese families had been forced to sell their homes and start over again in new economic areas lacking even the basic necessities. Hence, corruption, and once thought of as a Thu trademark. Everybody said that the South Vietnamese government was corrupt. Well, the communist government coming in was even more corrupt. Corruption is flourishing. A new Mandarin class has emerged, ready to sell anything from a place or fertile a new economic area to a visa to France. In other words, if you had enough money, you could get a visa to France. In all, some 300,000 people are being detained in re-education camps, which are in no way similar to the show camps set up for the benefits of visiting dignitaries and reporters. What they did around Saigon, they set up special camps, something like North Korea does today. And they had people in there manning those camps. So they brought the reporters in and said, look, see how well we're treating these people? They're getting food, they're getting medication, they're not really being worked hard. We're just trying to re-educate them. One of every 3 Saigon families has a member of one of the camps, according to French journalist Jean Lacouture, who made an automobile trip from Hanoi to Saigon in 1976. After a visit to a new economic area for former South Vietnamese near Phan Thiet, Lacouture wrote that it was a prefabricated hell and a place one comes only if the alternative, so it would be death. Camps for former officers and functionaries of the Saigon government were usually located in malaria-infested jungle areas. Thousands of camp inmates died from lack of food, medicine, or clothing. Thousands committed suicide. Some were secretly liquidated. Others perished through stage accidents. For example, former officers were forced to deactivate minefields with their bare hands. They were given a stick and told to go out there and dig up the mines. So the regime would not have to waste valuable bullets on them. After the officers had mostly been taken care of, it was a turn of the intellectuals, some 2,500 of whom were sent to re-education camps. Among them are journalists, authors, scholars, professors, Western-educated technicians, student leaders, third force leaders. The list of prominent Vietnamese in prison or in concentration camps included Catholic Bishop Nguyen Van Thuan, a 72-year-old Hoi Buddhist leader, forgive me as I know I'm pronouncing all this wrong, Lithong Trong, and 17 members of his family, Harvard-educated Tony Nguyen Huan, lawyer Tran Van Tru, and quite often a lot of the Viet Cong were sent off to their education camps also because they joined as nationalists. And of course, when the communists took over, they want to get rid of the nationalists. Meanwhile, a new means of breaking up armed resistance against the regime was added to the already formidable arsenal. On December 16th, Premier Phan Van Dong spoke to the 4th Communist Party Congress in Hanoi, announcing that 1 million South Vietnamese would be deported to the North in a 5-year population shift. In other words, so many people had gone to the South, they needed to move people back up to the North, so they were going to invite 1 million people to go back up north because I guess they needed people to work. A Vietnamese woman journalist who escaped after 16 months under communist rule had no news of her husband, a police officer who was detained at a re-education camp. She believed he was either dead or was deported to a labor camp in the North. There was no conciliation, no forgiveness, no leniency, only a careful, concealed, massive political purge. Father Andre, a Vietnamese-speaking Jesuit priest who was expelled from Saigon, said that as many as 20,000 Vietnamese had committed suicide after the communists took over. In the article that New York Review reprinted, Galenas wrote that one former policeman killed his 10 children and his wife and his mother-in-law and then killed himself. One South Vietnamese father, after explaining to it was necessary to put an end to their torment, passed out a poison soup to his family. 12 monks and nuns burned themselves by fire at their Duc So Pagoda in Phong Hep on November 2nd, 1975, to protest religious persecution. A convoy of 150 former South Vietnamese officers were massacred en route to a re-education camp, except one who feigned death. 4 U.S. trucks driven by former South Vietnamese army drivers, all the officers were blindfolded with their hands tied behind their backs. The trucks were preceded by an armored car and a tank. Suddenly, in the total dark of the countryside night, the leading tank and armored car sped up, and the following tank and armored car opened fire on the convoy. The wounded were killed in place. So they never made it to the re-education camps. Former South Vietnamese and military, government, business, and religious leaders, people the communists declared guilty of war crimes or who they feared could lead a counter-revolution, lived out their lives in hard labor, humiliation, sickness, and deliberately inflicted pain on them. A report by researchers at the University of California at Berkeley estimated that 65,000 people were executed in the 8 years after the communist victory took over. And you remember a while ago, they were going to free South Vietnam, going to liberate it. They only killed 65,000 people. The United States Department reported to Congress that executions numbered in tens of thousands. The communists consigned as many as 500,000 people to extended stays in the camps. Scholars believe that at one time there were as many as 300 camps throughout Vietnam, most of them near Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City. People were sent to camps for indefinite terms without bringing formal charges against them or conducting judicial proceedings of any kind. Somebody just had to not like you. The communists tortured prisoners in an attempt to get information about political opposition, military resistance, movements, and conspiracies to escape. According to former prisoners, the list of torture techniques included ripping out fingernails with pliers, whipping prisoners with live electric wires, hanging inmates from the ceilings and beating them, and forcing prisoners to drink water and then jumping up on their bloated stomachs. Disciplined prisoners by locking them in metal storage boxes called connexes, where the temperature is often soared above 120 degrees. Water was sometimes denied as punishment, and some former prisoners said they drank their own urine. The communists forced inmates to perform hard labor by providing only the most rudimentary food and medical care. Many prisoners starved to death, while others were left to die in a lingering, painful death from diseases. Conditions in these camps are so bad that discipline for even the most minor infraction can result in acute suffering, permanent physical impairment, and death, according to the State Department. The communists practice a form of genocide, said one former South Vietnamese colonel. The Vietnamese communists were too clever to kill us all in a bloodbath, as the Cambodian communists did in the killing fields. The colonel said they decided who they wanted to kill, worked them very hard, fed them almost nothing, and let the disease do the rest. There were 300 colonels in my camp originally. When we moved 2.5 years later, we left 37 graves behind. The communists did not want to re-educate us, said another former colonel. They wanted vengeance. In the Berkeley study, researchers said the camps were so sophisticated form of drip death that the communist regime uses for liquidating its class enemies. North Vietnamese spokesman Ha Hoa Thong called the reports of brutality in camps distorted and fabricated. Thong answered the allegations of torture with a statement from Justice Minister Pham Hinh. And this is what he had to say. We pursue a benevolent and very humane policy towards the prisoners, the statement said. There are, of course, regulations in any camp. If they are violated, it is necessary to ensure they are respected. But we are against torture. We punish torture. But on the other hand, prisoners must be punished who try to escape or destroy discipline in the camp. So none of that stuff I read to you before was torture. It was just readjustment. Some of them were kept in chains so long maggots hatched where the shackles rubbed their wrists and ankles. They went out of their way to degrade us in the camp, said 46-year-old former political warfare captain. I had to carry human waste to the rice fields to use as fertilizer. We could have used tools, but they made us use our hands. My arms were tied over my shoulder and behind my back during questions, said a 50-year-old former non-commissioned officer. There is no way to describe the pain. I wanted to die. They ignored sick people and let them die, said a former helicopter pilot who lives in Los Angeles. When I was in Andong, I slept near this guy whose whole body was infected. 1 million ants were swarming all over him, and he didn't appear to feel a thing. Later, he died. I saw a man in 1976 in Andong put in a barrel, said 50-year-old former colonel in Falls Church, Virginia. The guards beat on it and drove him crazy by doing this every day for 2 weeks. I think that mental torture was the worst, said another former colonel living in Falls Church. They would humiliate us, forcing us to bow to them when they insulted us. They'd wake us up in the middle of the night for this. They went on for years and very painful. The residual brutality against the Vietnamese who supported the Americans in the Saigon regime may explain why the Vietnamese who never left in mass during centuries of occupation by the Chinese, French, and Japanese left Vietnam in great numbers because of the way the communists treated them. Re-education camp prisoners were incarcerated for as long as 17 years, with most terms ranging from 3 to 10 years. I know one that was a friend of mine that was in the re-education camps for 3 years, and then they sent him to Hanoi to teach English because he could speak English. I know another group of men here who continued fighting after Saigon fell, and they spent between 12 to 15 years in the re-education camps. In order to flee racial, ethnic, religious, and political persecution, 2 million refugees had to escape in rickety, broken boats for the South China Sea, where they faced constant, unimaginable peril. They faced not only deadly storms, but also disease and starvation. The primary cause of death for the boat people were drowning and attacks by pirates, who murdered them or sold them to slavery and prostitution. Now, this is from people who've been liberated, who didn't feel like they were being liberated because the way the communist government was doing them. Vietnamese refugees in the United States and in many other countries, the week of April 30th is referred to as Black April, and it's used as a time of commemoration of the fall of Saigon. February 10th, if you live anywhere in the Raleigh area, will there be a Tet celebration in Raleigh at the fairgrounds at the what we call the Cow Palace. If you're anywhere in the area, I highly recommend you come down, meet some of the Vietnamese people. If you see me, I'm bigger than average bear. I'll introduce you to some people that were in those re-education camps, and you can ask them how they were. But I just wanted to say thank you for your time to watch the Lessons of Vietnam show. We hope you are entertained and learned something. Please tell your friends about the show. Our viewer count has really risen, but there's always room for one more, and then one more. Thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you again in February. Can you believe February is the next show? That's just unbelievable. February 13th to be exact. So looking forward to seeing you all back again in February. I just seemed like we just did the first show in January, but Godspeed and thank you and goodbye.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, streaminggear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.